Alright, moving on into community ecology. Communities, if you'll recall, are all the species in a given area. So these are interspecies relationships. Now, interspecies relationships or community relationships can actually be quite complex. Right? So some relationships, like predator and prey, are pretty standard types of relationships, but they can be much more complex than that. So, as an example, cats and rats. The normal relationship of a cat and a rat is that cats eat rats. But when you add another factor into this equation, right, a parasite called Toxoplasma gondii, Toxoplasma gondii can actually change a rat's behavior. All right. It's a parasite that affects their brain chemistry, and it causes them to actually seek out cats, and then naturally they get eaten. Right? And then that Toxoplasma gondii can spread into cats, and then onto more rats, and then onto more cats, etc. And the Toxoplasma gondii can actually impact human behaviors as well. Right? People who are infected with Toxoplasma gondii tend to have more reckless type of behaviors. Right? They get into more car accidents, for example. They have more sexual partners. It affects human behavior as well. So you can see the relationship between species can be quite a lot more complex than it might at first appear. So when we're talking about community relationships, right, in any given community there could be hundreds of species, right, and all of these species relationships can result in thousands and thousands of interactions. Right? So it's really quite impossible to describe all of these relationships all at once. So what community ecologists typically do is they'll look at two species and how does species A interact with species B. Now, when two species interact very strongly, it can result in something called co-evolution. Right? When we talk about natural selection impacting the evolution of species, in stabilizing selection or directional selection or disruptive selection, it was always the environment that caused a particular selective pressure. Right? But if another species is a part of that selective environment, that other species can exert evolutionary impact on another species. So, for example, predator-prey very often will exhibit coevolution. Right? As predators become faster, that could push pressure on the prey to become faster, which in turn puts pressure on the predators to become faster, etc., etc. And so the predator and prey have become co-evolved. Right? As another example, plants and pollinators will exhibit co-evolutionary relationships. This is a flower that Darwin saw in South America, and it has a really, really long bell. And just by looking at this flower, Darwin surmised that there was going to be a pollinator with a very long nose, or proboscis. And it wasn't until the mid-20th century that scientists discovered this moth. And it turns out that this moth is the pollinator of this particular flower. Right? So it shows you that those two species have become co-evolved. So because it's so difficult to describe all the relationships at once, like, as I mentioned, scientists will basically focus on individual relationships. Right? Species A and species B. And will characterize the relationships between those two species. And there are several terms that are used to describe these types of relationships, and these terms refer to the impact that the relationship has on the species involved. So, for example, a mutualism is a plus-plus interaction. It is beneficial for both species. A commensal relationship is a +0, so species 1 benefits from that relationship. Species 2 is more or less unaffected. Exploitative relationships, so predator-prey, parasite-host, and herbivore-plant. All these exploitative relationships are plus-minus. Right? One species gets a tasty meal, that's a plus. One species is the tasty meal, that's a minus. And then competition is considered bad for both species involved. That's a minus minus. All right, so those are the interspecies relationships that we'll talk about today. Right? And they're characterized by the impact that it has on both species. So the first of our relationships is a mutualistic relationship. So mutualisms are plus-plus interactions. So if you go out to the California deserts, you will see this plant called a yucca, and that yucca is pollinated by one species only, and that is the yucca moth. The yucca moth, on the other hand, will lay its eggs only in one place, and that is the flower bed of the flower of a yucca plant. So they've evolved in concert with one another. The yucca flower is only pollinated by the yucca moth. The yucca moth is only lays its eggs in the yucca flower. Right, we've talked about other mutualisms before, right? Mycorrhizae, for example, right? Lichens. These are all mutualistic relationships where both species benefit from that relationship. Right, mutualisms can come in various types, right? When we typically think of mutualistic relationships, we think of things like clownfish and anemone, right? You've seen in Finding Nemo. There are some other examples. Here's a shrimp that's blind, but it can dig a burrow. Here's a fish that can see but can't dig. So they live together in this burrow. And when they come out and they forage together, the shrimp always has one antenna on the fish. And when the fish freaks out and runs back into the burrow, the shrimp follows, even though he can't see anything, will follow the goby's lead. So the goby acts kind of like a seeing eye dog for the shrimp. Commensal relationships are +0. One species benefits, the other one is more or less unaffected. Right? So for example, barnacles on the rostrum of a whale. Right? So as the whale moves through the water flows over the barnacles to aerate them, and they can catch food that way. Right? And the barnacle really doesn't care. The barnacle benefits from getting water flowing over it all the time. And the whale doesn't care one way or the other. Right, here we have a buffalo. The buffalo, as it walks through the grass, will churn up the grass around it, and that will disturb a lot of insects, and that makes it easier for the birds to see. So the birds effectively have a rototiller that helps to scatter the insects and make them easier to catch, and the buffalo doesn't really care that the bird is on its back. So that's called the commensal relationship. Exploitative relationships are +- One species benefits, like this praying mantis here, and one species is harmed, like this hummingbird. Right, so these exploitative relationships are +-. They include herbivory, right, so plant eaters and plants, predation, and parasitism. Now, predator-prey interactions, it's important to understand, are very, very strongly influenced by natural selection. If a predator cannot secure its prey, it'll die. And if a prey is constantly being preyed upon by predators, it will die. And so predator-prey relationships are very strongly influenced by natural selection. And this relationship is so important that predator-prey relationships can, in fact, even govern the abundance of a particular prey or predator. So the classic example of this is the lynx and the snowshoe hare. So when the lynx are very abundant, that drives hare populations down, right? And then the hare populations, when they're down, means that there's no food for the lynx to eat, and so those populations go down. And when the lynx are rare, the hares can multiply, and their populations will go up, and that will cause the lynx populations to go up, and they just cycle back and forth with each other because they're locked together. Right. So predator-prey relationships are where you'll see a lot of adaptations in nature, things like camouflage and mimicry. These all allow predator and prey to be more effective at securing prey or avoiding predation. You'll see something called induced defense in plants, right? So when we typically think of cacti, we think of the spines that they have. But in places where there's no grazing, they don't really need the spines, and you'll see that they don't have them. So it's the predation or the herbivory that induces those defensive mechanisms. We've all heard of camouflage. This is when organisms are blended into their environments. Right, so you see a lizard here on a tree. It's blended into the bark. Here we have a leaf bug. There's a lot of things that blend into the environment, and that's to avoid detection. Right, so you'll see camouflage in prey species very commonly, but you'll also see them sometimes in predator species. Right, so the predator will hide and will ambush its prey when it walks by. If you're a prey species, one of the best defenses you can have are things like poisons and venoms. Right? So prey species can develop adaptations that allow them to defend themselves against predators. Right? But this by itself is not enough. If you're a frog, most frogs are sort of brown and green because they are trying to avoid being eaten. Right? But some of the frogs are very, very poisonous, as you might be aware. Right? But if that poisonous frog is brown or green, that doesn't really deter predators. Right? The predator's not going to know that particular thing is dangerous and will try to attack it anyway. And even though the toad or the frog might be able to kill the predator, it might still get damaged and injured in the act of predation. So if a frog or toad is dangerous, it's adaptive for it to advertise the fact that it's dangerous. Right? So in nature, you'll see very brightly colored organisms. Right? And generally speaking, the brightly colored organisms are venomous or poisonous. Right? Because they are advertising the fact that they are dangerous. Right? Sometimes you'll see species that are poisonous, and then species that aren't but look exactly like them. Right? So these species are benefiting from the predators being afraid of this particular model. Right? This phenomenon is called mimicry. So warning coloration is quite potent. Right? And every time you see a yellow and black insect, it signals on an evolutionary level that organism is dangerous. Right? But in fact, only one of these 4 insects is venomous, and it's this guy. So this guy is exhibiting warning coloration, and the other 3 are mimics. So prey species are under tremendous pressure to evolve defenses against predation, but the predators also have to evolve as well. Right? They can have behavioral adaptations, or they can become faster or better predators. Right? This here is a bombardier beetle, and the bombardier beetle in its defensive mode will stand on its head, and chemicals will shoot out of its abdomen here. And those chemicals are under very high pressure, and so as it goes through the nozzles in the abdomen, will reach very high temperatures as well. So it's kind of like burning hydrogen peroxide. It's like throwing burning hydrogen peroxide in the face of a potential predator. Right? But kangaroo rats will grab them and then stick the bombardier beetles into the ground, so the nozzles down here. And so the predators have to adapt as well. Right? The third type of exploitative relationship are parasitic relationships. Right? So there are different types of parasitism. Right? There's endoparasites like these worms here, ectoparasites like these ticks, and then there are nest parasites, right? Things like the cuckoo bird. These are birds that will lay their eggs in other birds' nests and have the songbirds raise the cuckoo birds. There's a phenomenon called parasitoidism, which I think is quite fascinating. This is when species will use other species to lay their eggs in. So here is a tarantula, and this is a tarantula hawk, which is a type of wasp. The wasp will sting the tarantula and paralyze it, and then will lay its eggs inside the tarantula's body. The last type of relationship is competition. Competition is minus. Now, in business classes, you may have heard that competition is good, right? In biology, competition is bad for both species. Even when one species is a vastly superior competitor, let's say species A is collecting 90% of the resources and species B is only collecting 10% of the resource, it's very clear that species B is hurt by species A, but species A is also hurt by species B, right? Even though it's collecting 90%, if species B were not around, it would be able to collect 100% of the resources. So this is why competition is considered bad for both species. So what is it that species compete for? And the answer is stuff. All the stuff that they need to survive. Things like food and water, shelter, nesting sites. All of these things fall under a term called ecological niche. Right? So the term ecological niche refers to all the things that an organism needs in order to survive. And when these ecological niches overlap, competition may ensue. Now, just because two niches overlap, it doesn't necessarily mean that there will be competition. Because there are things that organisms can do, and there are things that organisms actually do, right? So all the conditions that you can live in fall under something called the fundamental niche, and all the conditions that you prefer to live in fall under something called your realized niche. And generally speaking, the realized niche is only a fraction of the fundamental niche. For example, you could live in a place that's very, very warm. Right? Let's say an average temperature of 80 degrees. And so summer temperatures in the 105. It's not fatal to humans. Right? However, it's uncomfortable. And as a consequence, we prefer to live in environments that are a little bit cooler. There's places that there's things that you can eat that maybe you don't. Right? For example, if you don't eat beets, just as an example, right? So beets are part of your fundamental niche. You can eat them, right? But maybe you don't. So they're not part of your realized niche. So here we have two species, the blue and the yellow, right? And you can see that the fundamental niches of these two species overlap. So you would expect there to be competition here in this green box, right? But you can see that species 1 has restricted its fundamental niche, right? To create a realized niche that's smaller than its fundamental niche, and species 2 has done the same thing, so that because the realized niches don't overlap, there's no competition. There's two basic types of competition that you'll see in nature, something called interference competition and something called exploitative competition. In exploitative competition, the two species are trying to secure resources faster than the other guy. Whereas in interference competition, the two species will directly interact with each other and fight for those resources. It is much rarer in nature. Most of the competition that you see is exploitative competition. But competition is really an important concept to understand because of a principle called competitive exclusion. Competitive exclusion. The principle of competitive exclusion suggests that no two species can occupy the exact same niche. If two species niches overlap, one will always competitively exclude the other. This was illustrated by an experiment done with Paramecia, two species of Paramecia, Paramecium caudatum and Paramecium aurelia. And so what this scientist named Gauss did was he grew a culture of Paramecium caudatum, and he saw that within a flask they would exhibit logistic growth. And Aurelia also exhibited logistic growth. But when he grew them together, what he saw was that initially the abundance of the populations go up. But then what happens is the Aurelia continues to go up, but the caudatum eventually gets wiped out. And it's because the Paramecium Aurelia is competitively excluding the caudatum. So competition is bad for both species involved, and species will try to limit the amount of competition that will occur. Right? Upon hearing something like competitive exclusion, you might think about the nature that you've encountered, and you think to yourself, well, how is it that there can be an abundance of species in a given area? Right? It's because effectively what species are doing is they're dividing up a resource into smaller subsets. Right? So if you ever go down to the beach in California, you'll see these three birds. This bird up here is called the dowitcher. This one's called the whimbrel. And this one right here is called the curlew. Right? And you can see that they have different length bills and different length legs. And so what is happening is that if you imagine that this is the shoreline, and this is the ocean, the dowitcher will be in the shallow waters, digging for crustaceans. The whimbrel will be in slightly deeper waters, with its longer bill. And the curlew will have the longest legs and the longest bill, and can therefore sit in the deepest waters. So what they've done is they've divvied up the shoreline into separate resources. This is called niche partitioning, and it therefore minimizes the competition between species. Right, so niche partitioning can ultimately lead to something called character displacement. And this is when evolution has caused species to become different from one another in order to minimize competition. So on the island of Daphne in the Galapagos Islands, there's a finch called Geospiza fortis. That's this guy right here. And its bill is about yay big. On the island of Los Hermanos, there's one finch called Geospiza fulginosa, and you can see that it has the same size bills. But on the islands of Santa Maria and San Cristobal, there are both species there. So on Daphne, it's only fortis. On Los Hermanos, it's only fulginosa. But on these two islands, Santa Maria and San Cristobal, both species are there. So because their bills are the same size, you would expect there to be competition. But what has happened is that the fulginosa has smaller than normal bills, and the Geospiza fortis has larger than normal bills. Right? So what has happened is that in order to minimize competition, natural selection has driven these guys away from each other. This is something called character displacement. You can also see competition with carefully controlled experiments where you remove potential competitors. So this was a study that was done on barnacles. Barnacles, there are two species of barnacles, this guy called Thalamus and this guy called Semibalanus. And Semibalanus lives in the deeper parts of the water. Thalamus lives in the shallower parts of the water. So in some areas, what the scientists did was that they removed the Thalamus. And they saw that the Semibalanus just stayed where they were. And then in other plots, they removed the Semibalanus, and they saw that the Thalamus moved down into the deeper water. So this tells you that the competition is actually occurring here in the deeper water and not up here in the shallower water, because this upper part of the range is not part of the fundamental niche of the Semibalanus. They can't go up here. Right? Now the Thalamus can actually go down here if there weren't the Semibalanus. If you remove the Balanus, then the Thalamus can go down. But because the Semibalanus is there, the Thalamus has been competitively excluded from that deeper water. Okay, so those are all the species relationships. Now, community ecologists are also interested in what's going on with communities, because communities change over time, and that process of community change is called succession. There's two basic types of succession, primary and secondary. Primary succession refers to the colonization of brand new virgin territory. So, for example, a volcano comes out of the ocean. That land that develops there, and ultimately the terrestrial flora and fauna, right? How it colonizes the island and how that creates a community, that's called primary succession. So in North Carolina, those barrier islands that are formed, right? These are brand new pieces of land, and the way plants come in and then animals come in and settle the area and create a community, that's all called primary succession. Secondary succession, on the other hand, is when an ecosystem, a community, recovers after some sort of damage. So if there's a fire that comes through, right, things are dead, but there's still seeds and stuff in the ground. There's still nutrients in the soil. Right? So the recovery pattern is a little bit different than it is in primary succession. But as a general rule, the basic principles of succession start with the first things that come in are things like grasses, right? And they get replaced by things like bushes, and then those get replaced by trees, generally gymnosperms and then angiosperms. Right, so communities change over time. Now, the thing to understand about communities is that the balance of a community is actually quite fragile. When you consider, let's say there's 30 species in your community, they all have interactions with one another. Now, there are some species within this community that are simply more important than others. Right? These types of species are called keystone species. So keystones, if you're not aware, if you've ever seen like stone buildings, right, and you have an arched doorway that's made out of stones, right, you can understand how these stones can stand on top of each other because the weight of the stone on top is balanced on the stone underneath it. But the archway, those stones up here in this area over the arch become a problem because the gravity would force them down into this area that you need to keep clear. So these stones right here are actually hanging in the air. Right? And they're hanging there, and they're held together by this weird looking stone. This upside down, what is that, trapezoid? Upside down trapezoid. So as the stones on this side want to fall in that direction, and the stones on this side want to fall in this direction, they basically push up against the keystone. And that's what keeps the arch in place. Now, if you were to remove the keystone, this whole arch would fall down. Right? And in a similar way, when you're talking about the members of a community, if you remove a keystone species, the entire community will collapse. And so this is what I mean when I say that there are some species that are more important than others in maintaining the balance of a community. Just to give you an example, right, we have sea otters. And sea otters are marine mammals, right, but they're different than other mammals. They're really skinny, whereas most mammals like walruses and whales and seals, they're fat because the ocean's cold. They have that big fat layer of blubber. Otters are not like this. They're very skinny. Right? So the way they're able to survive in very cold water is that they eat a lot. And they have very dense fur that traps little air pockets, and that's what keeps them relatively warm. Now, in the 19th century, trappers would go out and they would catch these otters for their pelts. So as the otter populations declined, the things that they preyed upon started to go up in abundance. One of the foods that the otters eat a lot of are urchins. So when you remove the otters, the urchin population balloons. Now the thing about an urchin is that it grazes on kelp. Now if you're an urchin crawling here on the seafloor, you're not going to climb up to the very, very tall parts of the kelp. You're just going to eat this bottom part down here. Right? This bottom part right here is called the holdfast, and it basically anchors the entire branch of kelp to the rock. Now you've lost all your otters, you have a bajillion urchins, and all the urchins are grazing on these things. And what do you think happens? The whole kelp floats away. Right? And what you're left with is something called an urchin barren. Right? You can see that there's no kelp here, but you can see lots and lots of little urchins on the floor. Right? So you can see that the otter was a keystone species because its presence and its actions helped to keep everything else in balance, right? Helping to keep the urchin numbers low enough and that minimized the amount of grazing that occurred on the kelp forest, and that's what preserved the kelp forest. But by removing the keystone species, the entire community goes away, right? So your kelp forest gets turned into an urchin barren, and all the other species that relied on that kelp forest can't live there anymore. So just as you can screw up a community by removing a really important member of it, you can also screw up a community by adding a member that doesn't belong. Right? These are called exotic, invasive, or introduced species. Basically, you're introducing a species that doesn't belong into a community. Now, because it doesn't have any natural predators, maybe no diseases, right? It's possible for these exotic species to end up becoming a humongous problem. Right? And a really, really good example of this happened in Australia. Now, Australia has no native placental mammals. All the mammals there are either marsupials or monotremes. But as Australia got settled, some of the settlers decided to bring placental mammals with them, the mammals they were familiar with from Europe. In the early 20th century, a man decided to bring 24 rabbits from England to Australia. And he just let them run around on his little farm. Those rabbits started out in the southeast of Australia, spread from there to the northeast where all the sugarcane and tropical areas were. And they started to migrate across the continent, across the great outback. And this became a humongous problem, this wave of rabbits across the continent, because down here in the southwest of Australia is where all the farmland is. So in order to save the farmland, the Australian government got the idea to build this rabbit-proof fence across the entire continent. And as soon as they were done with this, they realized, oh no, there's rabbits on the other side. So they built a second rabbit-proof fence. And when they were done with this, oh no, there's rabbits on the other side. So they built a third rabbit-proof fence, all to keep the rabbits away from the southwest, where all the farmlands were. Right, so why were these rabbits so successful? One, they breed very, very rapidly. Two, they are habitat generalists. They can live in tropical places. They can live in dry places. They can live in temperate places. Right? And so in Europe, they have to have a very high reproductive rate because in Europe, everything kills rabbits. You have foxes, you have eagles, you have snakes. Everything kills rabbits. But in Australia, there's nothing that kills the rabbits. And so this very high reproductive rate ended up becoming a humongous problem for other wildlife, Australian wildlife. It's not just Australia. I mean, we have invasive species here in the United States. If you go to the American South, right, most of the forests of Georgia are covered in this ivy called kudzu. And you can literally travel hundreds of miles along a freeway through a forest and not see the trees because they're all blanketed in this Japanese ivy. In Guam, there was a snake that was introduced to the island on accident. The problem with that is that the species on Guam, the small mammals and the birds, have no experience with snakes. There's no natural snakes on Guam. And so what you end up having was this snake that could climb a tree that ended up killing most of the small mammals and most of the birds on Guam. So a buddy of mine, he's Guamanian, and we were talking about this, and he told me about a study where rather than going out and counting the snakes, the guy just basically documented how many power outages there were. And because the real problem is, or for the citizens of Guam, is that one of the real problems is that the snakes will climb up the telephone poles or the power lines, right, and will get electrocuted and cause a power outage. So based on the data, you can see that the number of power outages are on the rise, and scientists surmise that this means that the snake population is also on the rise. Just for the latest update on this, because the brown tree snake was introduced by most probably the U.S. military, the U.S. military has basically taken the reins in trying to remove the tree snakes from Guam. And so there are efforts to sprinkle the island with mice that are laden with poison to kill off all the tree snakes. So the thing to understand is that community relationships can change over time, and environmental conditions can also impact community change. So as the Earth itself has changed in terms of climate, so too has community composition. And what we're seeing is that as a result of human activities and the way we've changed local environments, we've seen a change in community composition. Right? What this means in practical terms, and this is not something we'll spend a lot of time on in this class, but what this means in practical terms is that human impacts on global biodiversity are very, very significant. When we graze cattle or build our farms or build a mine, it can fundamentally and radically change community compositions throughout the earth. Right? So we will have one lecture where we talk about human impacts on the environment, but I will tell you right now at the outset that our impact on other biodiversity is much, much more significant than I think most people appreciate. And it's because community compositions change over time. They change in response to environmental changes, whether they're natural or wrought by humans.